So, I love literature, and I especially love Russian literature. One of my favorite opening lines ever is from Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. Absolute gem of an opening line. And at the moment, I am reading good old Dostoevsky, The Idiot. It's just an incredible book. I am obsessed with it. Um, so I really love Russian literature, and I love all the different authors and all their different works, and they really are just geniuses. But I've been thinking about, why do all these authors come from the same period in time, same time period, 19th century, and from the same place, St. Petersburg? Tolstoy's a little bit different. He's like a bit of Moscow, a bit of St. Petersburg, but most of them are all from St. Petersburg. So why is this? That is what I am inviting you to come along with me to discover. So welcome to my cozy little chat about St. Petersburg and Russian literature and the history of both. So the main sources that I will be using are I've got a lot of books. The Cambridge Introduction to Russian Literature by Carol Emerson. She is an amazing Slavic scholar. And also I will be using Julie Buckler's Mapping St. Petersburg. She just has so much knowledge about the literary landscape of the city. So I will be using mainly those two scholars to help us navigate this topic. So we will start by understanding the history of Russian literature, just on its own. And then we will go into the history of St. Petersburg, and we will try to investigate how they intersect between each other. And then from there, we will look at some examples of famous Russian literary geniuses and what they write about. And then we will finish off with a bit of a critical review about the legacy of Russian literature and of St. Petersburg. So let's just jump right in. So for most of Russian history, there isn't much literature because most Russians were illiterate. The only written down literature is like monks writing down the histories of kings and battles and like religious texts. But these were only written for other monks and other kings to read. The first printing press, which by the way was invented in 1440, only came to Russia in 1563 by Tsar Ivan the Terrible. But it didn't last long, and it was destroyed by a mob in 1565. So that didn't work out very well. Most Russians are not really interested in writing down their stories. As Carol Emerson puts it,
medieval Russian culture was rich, but not in the printed word.
There were many folk stories and epics, legends of kings and saints' lives all throughout the medieval period. And with these stories, there was no real distinction between fact and fiction. The only distinction was between sacred texts and folk stories or entertaining stories for the common people. And this literary environment was very difficult for any major works of literature to be produced, mainly because the only written language that was around at this time was the Slavic church language of Cyrillic. And the problem with Cyrillic is that it didn't really have any rules. It wasn't really like any of the other languages that produced works of literature during the medieval period, like Italian with Dante and I can't remember what it's called now. That's right, the Divine Comedy. And then like Shakespeare in English with all of his plays. Cyrillic wasn't like that language. It wasn't able to do that sort of thing because it didn't really have rules, and it was just a church language. So the entertaining stories that were for the common people were passed down through oral traditions and through rituals and ceremonies and dances and those sorts of things. For a long time, there was this sort of tension between the courtly or official religious and sacred sort of texts and stories, and then the less official, more like folk stories and more the folk people, the Russian people just doing their own little thing. But this environment where these two cultures were separated and didn't really have much to do with each other changed in the 18th century when Russia decided to become European, or at least Peter the Great did. So this is the time that many call the pursuit of national identity by means of imitation. In the world of courtly language, the solution to this problematic Cyrillic was to just use French instead. So aristocrats would teach their children French, and that was the language of high society, and that was the language that people would write in, while in the meantime, Peter the Great was reforming Cyrillic to become a more usable written language for people outside of the clergy. This started in 1708, but it took a long time to completely reform Cyrillic to the civil language that Peter had envisioned and to the written Russian language that we know today. But that was Tsar Peter the Great's whole thing. He really wanted to bring Russia up to speed with Europe. In addition to language, Peter also decided to build his own new imperial city. That is where St. Petersburg comes into the picture. Tsar Peter the Great founded St. Petersburg in 1703. The purpose of the city was not just to replace Moscow, but it was more so to imitate European cities and European courtly culture and European political power. This is evident even in the name of the city being St. Petersburg, because Berg is the Dutch or German word for city, not the Russian word. And just like with Tsar Ivan the Terrible with his printing press, the people were not very happy about this new city because it wasn't really their culture. The common people's culture had nothing to do with European ideals. And that's where this tension comes into play again. Because while the city had all this beautiful architecture and this stately grandeur about it, it didn't have any cultural history like Moscow did. Moscow had centuries of cultural history. St. Petersburg had nothing. It was just built up from the ground. So while the city didn't look Russian at all, it was often compared to Rome or other European cities, it did start to gain a bit of a organic Russian culture by the very people who were building it, mainly the serfs or the peasants. And it gained this sort of urban legend around it because it was a very dangerous city to build, and many of these serfs died during the process. So it was colloquially termed the City of Bones. This is an excerpt from Anatoly Bakhtiarov's, something like that, The Belly of St. Petersburg from 1887, and it's about a glue factory on the outskirts of the city. And, glue factories use bones to make glue, just so you know. On Gutevsky Island, on the shore, rises a magnificent mountain of bones, whose height is greater than that of any 5-story building in Petersburg. So this imagery evokes two juxtaposing cultural ideas from earlier on around the city's founding. So on the one hand, the opening scene from Alexander Pushkin's poem The Bronze Horseman shows Peter the Great on a hill, magnificent mountain, where he's overlooking the swamps where he's going to build the city. And the other picture is, of course, that folklore and the urban legend view of the city as a city of bones. So the city was a bit of an embodiment of this tension between folk and elite culture. And it had to figure out a way to balance these two cultures. And the solution to this problem was self-mythologization. So, mythologization of the palaces and the slums and everywhere in between was why St. Petersburg culturally survived. But again, this city was a contradiction. The city was planned out by the Tsar. It was a bit of an artificial city, and the architecture resembled classical Roman architecture, European ideals of civilization. But at the same time, it was culturally developing its own urban legends and folklore by the Russian serfs, the illiterate Russian serfs who were building the city. So this contradiction and tension was everywhere in the city. It was a part of everyday life in St. Petersburg, and it became the inspiration of the artists and writers who were living there. So, here are a few examples from famous literary geniuses of the 19th century St. Petersburg. So, starting off with Alexander Pushkin's The Bronze Horseman that we mentioned before. It is a very good example, and it presents St. Petersburg as both a magnificent achievement and a dangerously artificial city. Peter the Great appears almost godlike as he creates the city from marshland. Yet the flood reveals how vulnerable the ordinary people are who live within his vision. The poem captures both admiration for the imperial project and sympathy for the people who have suffered from it. So this is an excerpt from just after the flood. Yevgeny shuddered. Terribly, his thoughts grew clear to him. He recognized the place where the flood played, where greedy waves had pressed, rioting around him angrily, and the lions and the square, and him who motionlessly held aloft his bronze head in darkness, him by whose fateful will the city had been founded by the sea. How terrible he was in the surrounding murk. And Nevsky Prospect from 1835 by Nikolai Gogol transformed St. Petersburg into a city of illusion. So the appearances of the elite were constantly deceiving. This reflects the city's uncertain identity, a place attempting to imitate European culture, but also yearning for a culture of its own. So this quote is at the end of the Nevsky Prospect.
It deceives at all hours, the Nevsky Prospect does, but most of all when night falls in masses of shadow on it, throwing into relief the white and dun-coloured walls of the houses, when all the town is transformed into noise and brilliance, when myriads of carriages roll over bridges, postilions shout and jolt up and down on their horses, and when the demon himself lights the street lamps to show everything in false colours.
And my favorite author, Fyodor Dostoevsky, he saw St. Petersburg as a city of extremes, wealth and poverty existing side by side. Dostoevsky was much more interested in portraying the common man, and he often interpreted St. Petersburg as a psychological landscape. Characters such as Raskolnikov from Crime and Punishment, 1866, wandered through the city, and the city was like a reflection of his own psychological turmoil. And this sort of idea makes St. Petersburg a bit of a participant in the novel's philosophical question. So this is the opening line from Crime and Punishment. It immediately places the reader in poverty and in crowded housing and in psychological pressure.
On an exceptionally hot evening early in July, a young man came out of the garret in which he lodged.
Another one of my favorite stories is his short story, White Nights. And in this story, we follow the main character on an emotional and psychological journey as he wanders night after night through the city, getting to know Nastenka. They admire the aesthetics of the white night sky more than they do of the aesthetics around them in the city. And this focus on the natural beauty provides feelings of bliss and happiness, and it also kind of is in unspoken opposition to the imperial monuments and the artificial aesthetics of the city, like the statue of Peter on his horse. So the thread between these authors is their unique perspective from an isolated in-betweenism. They do not fully belong in either culture, whether elite or folk. Instead, they are the bridge between the two cultures by observing the tension between the two and presenting it a way for both sides to understand each other better. So, how does this group of artistic in-betweeners come about? Between 1703 and the 19th century, there were many changing ideas and attitudes from the elite towards art, literature, culture, and the serfs. So Catherine the Great was even more determined to civilize Russia than Peter was. She encouraged Enlightenment ideals, but because her court and the elite culture it was strongly connected with the power of the church, her encouragements for Enlightenment kind of fell a little bit outside of the courtly culture. And it fell on this new social class that was accommodated by the new city. You see, new property owners buying property in St. Petersburg were left isolated from richer, wealthier families that were already well established. And they were categorized by Catherine as raznochinsty. She encouraged art and culture and learning, and this new group, the raznochinsty, took up her calling and became the intelligentsia. As Julie Buckler writes about the raznochinsty term, this notoriously vague term has been evoked in terms of shifting and indeterminate boundaries, spontaneous development, and multiple structures, which seems the only way to characterize the range of interstitial groups between the primary established social categories. Instead of a property-owning class whose influence came to rival that of the declining aristocracy, it is said Russia had its intelligentsia, a tiny minority rich only in moral and cultural values to mediate between the privileged elite and the illiterate peasantry. And this is the group that the Russian literary geniuses were a part of. The 19th century philosopher Vissarion Belinsky, I think I have his book here, I'm not getting that out, it's at the bottom of the pile, was an influential and prominent figure in this new group. And he was concerned with using literature to create a new national character. He claimed that Russian literature should be the strivings of Russian society towards self-awareness, and it was Belinsky who interpreted Pushkin as the first original national Russian writer through his combination of European influences and Russian attributes. It was this attractive interpretation that began the mythologization of Russian writers. However, the legacy of St. Petersburg literature and Russian literature in general is not entirely uncomplicated. Modern critics such as Anna Narenskaya have questioned the tendency to treat Russian literature as something uniquely sacred and almost untouchable. From the 19th century to today, literature has become one of the primary ways for Russians to attempt to understand themselves as a nation. Writers are expected not merely to tell stories, but to also provide philosophical, social, and political questions and answers. And as a result, authors such as Pushkin, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy have come to occupy an almost prophetic and untouchable position within Russian culture. This is evident in St. Petersburg itself, as it is littered with many sculptures and statues and busts and memorabilia of all these different Russian writers. And in some ways, this expectation emerged from the very conditions that produced St. Petersburg literary culture. Because the city lacked deep historical roots, literature became one of the tools for which St. Petersburg self-mythologized and constructed a cultural identity. Yet this success created a new problem. If literature becomes responsible for explaining a city and much more a nation, then writers risk being remembered as symbols rather than as artists. And from this, a very interesting question is raised, but I won't answer it just here. I'll leave that for you to look into if you're interested. But the question is, did Russian literature merely describe Russian or St. Petersburg identity? Did it become trapped by the responsibility of creating it? I suggest watching this video of a discussion with Anna Norenskaya if you're interested. But ultimately, St. Petersburg became the center of Russian literary culture because it embodied the contradictions that defined modern Russia itself. The city stood between Europe and Russia, elite and folk culture, and artificial design and organic development. Writers transformed these contradictions and tensions into stories and novels and poems and philosophical novels as well that helped Russians to imagine their own national identity. Yet perhaps the enduring legacy of these writers is not simply its greatness, but the expectation that literature should carry the weight of explaining a city and a nation. The myth of St. Petersburg created great literature. Like, I am enjoying these writers so much. But this literature also became a part of the myth. And that is all from me today. Thank you very much for listening.